Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. For decades, some of the absolute largest structures ever built by humanity, we're talking massive ships the length of 3 football fields, would just vanish, completely without a trace. No distress signal, no wreckage, just a colossal ship and its entire crew swallowed whole by the ocean. It was a genuinely terrifying reality hanging over the entire maritime industry. When maritime authorities and classification societies finally started digging into the data, a pretty chilling pattern emerged. It turns out the vast majority of these lost vessels shared something in common. They were all over 15 years old. Their massive steel structures had been silently weakened by unseen, really insidious deterioration that just went completely unnoticed, right up until it was too late. And the human cost here, it was absolutely staggering. Just in 1990 alone, over 200 seafarers lost their lives because of these catastrophic structural failures. This wasn't just, a string of bad luck. This was a full-blown systemic crisis that demanded immediate, industry-wide action to figure out exactly why these giant ships were literally breaking apart. To really put the scale of this emergency into perspective, during the peak of this crisis period, we were seeing between 3 and 9 bulk carriers lost every single year. And remember, these weren't small fishing boats. These were massive floating warehouses carrying tens of thousands of tons of cargo. Okay, let's dive into our roadmap for today. We'll be looking at 1. The bulk carrier crisis. 2. Cargo hold damage mechanisms. 3. The transverse watertight bulkhead. 4. The physics of failure. And finally, 5. Actions to prevent disasters. Section 1. The bulk carrier crisis, a historical perspective. So the early 1990s really marked a major turning point. After years of concerning reports from captains out at sea, the sheer volume of sudden sinkings forced massive investigations into what was actually going wrong in the open ocean. And the reality of a sideshell plating failure is absolutely terrifying. Ships were literally losing their outer steel skin, because this plating, along with its internal framing, had been slowly eaten away by corrosion and heavy cargo impacts. The sheer force of the ocean simply tore it open. And the most chilling part? These catastrophic failures happened so fast that the crew usually didn't even have time to send a single distress message. It creates a deadly domino effect. Just imagine thousands of tons of water violently bursting into hold number 1 through a corroded hull. The massive weight of that rushing water, combined with the heavy cargo already in there, violently forces the internal wall separating the holds, the bulkhead, to completely collapse. Then the water blasts right into hold number 2. This is called progressive flooding. And once that chain reaction starts, the ship loses its buoyancy at the bow so incredibly fast that it sinks almost immediately. Section 2. Cargo hold damage mechanisms, the front line. So, you might be wondering, what exactly is weakening these massive steel structures in the first place? Well, the inside of a bulk carrier's cargo hold is an unbelievably hostile environment. It takes a brutal combination of chemical and physical beatings every single day. These hidden dangers silently strip away the ship's strength long before a severe storm ever hits. For instance, when high-sulfur coal gets wet, it literally produces highly corrosive sulfuric acid that just eats right through the ship's steel. On top of that, super dense cargoes like iron ore push the ship's structural stress limits to the absolute maximum. And then you have the raw, brute physical trauma. Think about massive stevedore grabs and bulldozers violently slamming into the ship's internal frames during unloading, severely denting and buckling the steel. If those impact damages are just ignored or, patched up poorly, you're essentially sailing with a ticking time bomb. Section 3. The transverse watertight bulkhead, the critical boundary. All of that internal damage we just talked about directly threatens the absolutely most vital defensive structure on the ship, the transverse watertight bulkhead. This corrugated steel wall is quite literally the only barrier standing between a localized hull leak and a total catastrophic loss of the vessel. Now, what's really interesting is that the structural failures actually tend to begin at the upper attachments. Dangerous cracks often start forming right at the crucial connection points, specifically areas like the upper stool and the upper shelf plate. These act as the structural joints connecting the bulkhead to the deck above. These specific transition areas face immense metal fatigue, especially when ships carry alternate hold loads that make the whole hull constantly flex and distort at sea. And the bottom of the bulkhead? That's even more critical. Down there, you have the lower shelf plate and the angled shutter plate. Those are the sloped sections designed to let cargo easily slide off. These lower areas suffer absolutely massive stress concentration. especially in tanks used for both cargo and ballast water. If a microscopic crack develops down here, say starting near the inner bottom plate because a bulldozer happened to scrape away the protective paint, the massive water pressure will ruthlessly exploit that tiny weakness and rip the entire bulkhead wide open. Section 4. The physics of failure. Invisible enemies. But look, physical dents and chemical corrosion, that's only half the story. The other half involves the invisible forces of physics that multiply all these damages, taking a weakened ship and just snapping it in two. We really have to contrast two very different types of forces here. First, you have static loads. This is the sheer, resting weight of the cargo, the fuel, the ballast water, and the ship itself while it's just sitting in still water. But then you have dynamic loads. These are the violent, relentless, cyclical forces of ocean waves, sudden acceleration, and the hull violently slamming into the sea. The absolutely crucial takeaway here is this. If you overload the static side by packing way too much cargo into a single hold, you completely destroy the ship's structural reserve. You leave it with literally zero capacity to survive the intense dynamic beatings of a rough, open ocean. And when those forces exceed the ship's design limits, the results are nothing short of catastrophic. For example, asymmetric loading can actually physically shear the transverse bulkhead, literally pulling the massive steel structure in opposite directions until it tears. Or consider shallow draft loading, which is when you put really heavy cargo right in the center without enough outward buoyancy from the surrounding water. This actually bends the double bottom downwards until the massive steel structure permanently distorts. I mean, that is literally how you break a ship. Section 5. Actions to prevent disasters. Taking control. Okay, so understanding all of these hidden dangers leads us to the most important part, taking control. Because the truth is, the vast majority of these structural failures are entirely preventable if you just use the right operational strategies. It all comes down to a really strict, mandatory two-stage planning process. You absolutely cannot just dump cargo into a hold and hope for the best. Step 1 is developing a comprehensive stowage plan. This maps out a completely safe departure condition, verifying that you aren't exceeding any maximum tonnage limits. Step 2 is the loading and unloading plan. This dictates the exact incremental sequence of how the cargo and ballast will be moved step by step. And stress calculations, checking those exact shear forces and bending moments, must be actively performed at every single one of those incremental steps to avoid a disaster. Operationally speaking, ship officers need to be running through this checklist constantly. First, you minimize corrosion by obsessively maintaining the paint coatings on those vulnerable frames and bulkheads and making sure to wash away corrosive salt and acid with fresh water. Next, you prevent structural damage by actively supervising the stevedores and legally demanding they report and correctly repair any bulldozer impacts. You strictly adhere to the loading manual to avoid any local overloading. And finally, you absolutely must monitor the cargo itself. That means trimming it perfectly level so it supports the side shells and outright rejecting any cargo that has too much moisture and might dangerously liquefy during the voyage. Because ultimately, physics just doesn't care about shortcuts. As we've seen today, a single microscopic crack in a bulkhead, or even just a few neglected dents in a side frame, can lead to rapid progressive flooding that can sink 80,000 tons of steel in a matter of minutes. The ocean is incredibly unforgiving. So I want to leave you with this thought. Is your next loading plan treating the ship's internal structure with the profound respect it demands? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning out there.